also going to share my screen so you can get something up. So welcome to the first event of Green Month with the Mercer Hive Society. We have a lot of different events planned. Today, of course, is the first. We have the Native Pollinator event with Dr. BC, who will be teaching us about pollinator plants and various other things, I'm sure. On the 10th, we have the Nature Hike and Scavenger Hunt at Emerson River Park. On the 11th, the Green Coalition is hosting the Okmulgee River Cleanup. On the 17th, we are volunteering at the Mulberry Gardens to help them prepare some raised planters and some other things that they need some extra people to help with. On the 22nd, we have the Earth Day event, which will be a combined plant sale and game table. On the 23rd, we're showing the documentary called The Pollinators, which focuses on bees and migratory beekeepers in the United States agriculture system. And the Green Coalition will also be showing the movie The Lorax at some point. After that point, they haven't nailed down a date yet. This will be updated when they have that information for us. So without further ado, I will let Dr. BC take over, and we will see what she teaches us.
All right, thank you so much. So I'm going to do the same thing with sharing my screen here. There we go. Oh, went forward. Let's go backwards. All right, welcome everyone. So yes, I am going to talk a bit about pollinators today. So I am a plant ecologist. I don't actually work too much with pollinators. My research is starting to dip into pollinators a little bit more, but I'm definitely much more of a plant person. And so that's one of the reasons I was excited to talk to this group, because it is with plants, it's one of the ways that everyone can support pollinators, that not everyone can have a hive or maybe even wants a hive, but by working with plants, anyone, and I think everyone should support pollinators. So the first thing I want to start with just some basics. I find even in my own biology classes that sometimes people are a little fuzzy on exactly what pollination is. So let's kind of go over a little bit of details here. So I've got a figure here with two flowers. And most flowers have two parts that we kind of generally think of, the male part and the female part. And so the male part is the part that produces the grains of pollen. And so when a pollinator visits the flower, if it is a bee, sometimes they're there to actually collect the pollen, but lots of pollinators are also there to get nectar. So a lot of flowers, in order to attract pollinators, will make this nectar. So the nectar is kind of the sugar part, and the pollen offers a protein heavy package for pollinators to collect. So as they get that pollen, either on purpose in the case of the bees, or by accident, lots of pollinators just simply brush past these anthers, those are the parts that are making the pollen, and end up with pollen on them. Then what the plant is hoping that pollinator will do is go to then a flower of the same species. So you can see I have pictures here of the same flower, and that's important. Pollinators will often go to many different kinds of flowers, but for the plant's purpose, it really needs it to at least go to one other flower of the same species. As it gets there, again, often not on purpose, and this is the case too with bees, is bees are really fuzzy often, or they have parts of them that it can be a bit fuzzy. And so they have that pollen just kind of sticking to them, and they brush past what is called the stigma. And this stigma is part of what we consider the female part of the flower. And that pollen sticks to it. The stigma is often kind of has a sticky surface to it, and so the pollen rests there. And now at that point, the pollinator has done its job. It's moving on. It's going to see other plants to get more nectar and maybe more pollen. But this is where the good stuff happens for the plant, is that pollen then sends a tube down into the ovary. The ovary contains the eggs or the ovules of the plant. And then that pollen grain continues dividing and basically makes sperm that take its way down that tube and fertilize that ovule. Now you have what will become a seed. So this ovary is future fruit. So let's say this flower is not a peach flower, but let's say it is a peach flower. This part, though, you would have a single ovule because a peach has a single seed, the pit, right? So you have a single ovule, that pollen fertilized that ovule and develops into a seed, and that outside ovary part is then what becomes the fruit. So for very obvious reasons, this is really important for the plant to be pollinated. So that's one of the reasons that as a plant ecologist, I have concerns with pollinators or want to support pollinators, because I don't get new and more plants if plants don't get pollinated. And for a lot of plants, they really need that animal that's there, that pollinator, whether it is a bee, whether it is a butterfly, whether it's a dragonfly. It could even be a bat, it could be a beetle. Lots of things act as pollinators, but they really need something to move that package. But not all plants need that. We're pretty aware of that this time of year. If you have allergies, you know when the pollen counts get high and low, but those are for plants often that don't have a showy flower. So mostly what we're breathing in is pollen from things like pines or oaks or hickories or maples. And if you kind of think like, what's a maple flower look like? Maybe something probably isn't coming to mind because they're tiny, they're barely visible. You're not going to see them easily, and they're definitely not showy. And that's because they're not advertising. They're not saying, hey, pollinator, come see me, because they just make a ton of pollen and throw it out into the air. Whereas plants that have pretty flowers are saying, hey, come get my pollen. And so their pollen tends to be heavy. So if it has a big old flower on it, it's not giving you allergies. It's the stuff you can't see that's making you sneeze this time of year. All right, so now that we have some basics about pollination, I do want to also mention that from this, what you can see is that this is what we call a mutualism in ecology, that both species are really benefiting from this interaction. It's not like, oh, it's just for the good for the pollinators, or, oh, it's just good for the plants. They're really benefiting and often really need this interaction that they have with each other. So the rest of my talk, I want to talk about how we can support pollinators. And one of the biggest ones, as you might guess as a plant ecologist for me, is to plant native plants. Your question might be, well, okay, I get that pollinators need plants, they need the pollen, they need the nectar, but maybe why native plants? Maybe, I have seen bees on my crepe myrtle. Crepe myrtles are actually Asian. They're not native to the South, even though we like to plant them everywhere. And you're right, a lot of pollinators aren't really picky. They'll pollinate and visit a lot of things. But in particular, as I was thinking, with the hive society of those honeybees, well, honeybees are about 8 species of bees total that make honey, but there are about 20,000 species just of bees, let alone all those other things that we talked about that are pollinators, the butterflies, the moths, the beetles, all those sorts of things. And so a lot of times those different pollinators have developed relationships with very specific plants over their kind of evolutionary history. And so if we just concentrate, say, on honeybees, well, they're going to visit a lot of things. But if we're thinking about pollinators as a whole, with native plants, we're really supporting their entire ecosystem and not just, say, the nectar that they need. We can think of things like, say, moths. They spend a period of their time as caterpillars, and they need native plants to eat while they're caterpillars before they then turn into a moth. And so by having those native plants, you are supporting the whole of the pollinator ecosystem, not just kind of that small portion of a few types of bees. So I'm going to show you some ways that we can think about how and what information you might need to plant native plants. So I know this has a lot of information, and I don't expect you to be able to read all of it, but it comes from the Xerces organization, and they are an organization that wants to supplant insect pollinators. And what they have provided is a planting guide for different parts of the United States. And so this is part of the Southeastern Planting Guide, and it has a ton of really helpful information, particularly for those who might want to support honeybees in particular. So one of the things we see here on the side, it says early, mid, late. That's telling you the time that these plants are flowering. And so if you're trying to support a hive of honeybees, you need them to be eating all the time when they are active. And so you can't just be like, oh, I hear bees like this plant. Well, that plant might only flower for a month, but the bees need food all year round, or really all season, I won't say year. But you can think about how each one of these then could help support when they first arrive early, as they're continuing to eat through the spring, into summer, and then into the late fall. So the next thing is in the columns here, it says forbs. That's just another word that we use for non-woody plants. So these are things like perennials that you're going to plant for flowers. So we have their common name and their scientific name. The next thing, this list of colors, is telling you the color of their flower. And so one of the nice things this shows is that you can have a wide range of flowers. It's not like, oh, you can only plant yellow flowers. Those are the only things bees like. No, actually, bees like lots of different colors of flowers. And so as you're thinking about designing your garden, you can keep that in mind. The other thing is that it tells you feet. And so this tells you how tall the flower is. And that can also sometimes tell you about what types of pollinators might be attracted to it. But it is also design information as you're thinking about building your garden, how tall you want certain plants to be. The next is looking at either low, medium, or high, and that's telling you how much water it needs. And so if you want something that is really maintenance free, it would be helpful to have something that has only low water needs, or even maybe medium water needs, so that you can kind of just plant it, leave it alone, let the pollinators do their thing. And then this final is really kind of showing how these plants support all kinds of pollinators, that yes, they're good for honeybees, but they are also good for so many other species, both as they're flowering, but as I also mentioned, they're leaves for those caterpillars. And so these do so much good for so many species, in addition to looking pretty. So I can show you that with a few species that are on this list. This is white indigo. This is one of those early species. My white indigo has, in my yard, has thrown up its flower shoot. It's, ready to burst at any moment now. The next one is penstemon. This is a really easy to grow plant, really pretty purple flowers here. Lots of different native species that kind of fall under this category, and it's going to be a good kind of mid through the whole summer type plant. And the final one is goldenrod. This is one of those that kind of gets a bad reputation because right around when people are starting to get hay fever, so those fall allergies, this is in bloom. And so lots of people look at it and be like, that plant, right? I'm so allergic to that plant. But like I said before, if it has a showy flower, if it's colorful, if it's, easy to see its flower, then it's probably not the thing that's causing your allergies. And that's true for goldenrod. It's something called ragweed that has tiny little green flowers that you would not notice at all, that's actually giving you allergies. And this is something that, again, easy to grow, easy to the point that can sometimes get a little weedy, but the bees are going to love this. So this is giving you just a smattering of some nice plants that you could easily put in your yard. Another thing I wanted to kind of mention is there's a guy by the name of Doug Tallamy, and he honestly has taught me a lot about pollinators and the importance. He is an entomologist and an ecologist, and he started doing some studies looking at different types of species found on different kinds of plants, and particularly looking at invasive and non-native plants. And he was really kind of shocked to see how little non-native plants supported those caterpillars that I mentioned. And a lot of us don't care too much about caterpillars. And a lot of times we might be like, yeah, having less caterpillars in my yard's a good thing, right? I don't want that. But if you like pollinators, well, remember, a lot of those caterpillars are going to become pollinators. And if you like birds, this is the stuff birds really like to eat. We give birds seed and they'll eat that. But what they really want is a big, fat, juicy caterpillar to feed their babies. And they often need hundreds, thousands of those to feed those babies. And so if you like a diverse ecosystem, you really need to be planting these natives. And so he's kind of this idea of, why are we putting so much work into something that is only pretty? Pretty's nice, but you're only getting pretty when you could do so much more. And so he's proposing that people plant at least a small portion of their yard with native plants. And if you start putting all those little pieces together, it could be larger than our largest national park. His goal is to basically have what he's calling a homegrown national park made up of private property of native plants that cover a total of 20,000 acres. And that is larger than our largest national parks in Alaska. And so we're just kind of keeping those pieces. And that also basically makes stepping stones for those pollinators. So as pollinators move through the environment, they're moving through a lot of stuff that is not pollinator friendly. You think about the sidewalks, the parking lots, the buildings, all these sorts of things, the cars, the pollution, that if we have these little respites in our yards where they can land, where they can lay eggs, where they can gather food, then that's going to support their ecosystem as a whole. And I didn't even know this. I added this slide today because as I was looking at my Facebook, I was seeing all my native plant groups being very excited because just today, Congress had a resolution that decided that April is now going to be National Native Plant Month. And so it's a really nice recognition for this kind of ongoing fight that many people have had of that we need to include more native plants in our gardens to support our ecosystems. Because right now, so many of our gardens, you could be stepping in Asia right now because so many of our plants come from Asia, or you could be stepping in Europe because so many plants are European. And so we really need to appreciate more of what we have and the good that they do. The plant that I've pictured here is another great plant to put in your yard. It's called mountain mint. It's a native species that grows very easily. Again, sometimes a little too easily. I'm constantly giving it away to people because it grows so well. But when it's flowering, even though it's not super showy, its flowers are somewhat small, it's like the whole plant is buzzing because it is completely covered in so many pollinators. And that brings me to part 2 of things that I would like you to do to support pollinators. And that's mow a little less. Actually, a lot of my advice is to just maybe take it easy on your yard a little bit. That sometimes we get a little overzealous of trying to have a single plant. We put a lot of work into making a monoculture, a single plant grass. Grass is one of those wind pollinated species, so it does nothing for the bees. We can't eat it. Yet we spend a whole lot of time making it as perfect as we can. So I have the philosophy, green is green and weeds are green too. And if you keep them occasionally mowed, it looks like a half decent lawn. But here I'm asking you to mow a little bit less because in amongst that grass that is not helpful to the pollinators, are all kinds of little flowers. And those flowers can be really supportive to pollinators, particularly this time of year. This time of year is when all those little weeds start popping up in your yard. And it's also the time the pollinators are just getting started and really desperate for food. And so by leaving even those dandelions and maybe some violets and some other things going just a little longer, I'm not asking you to get in trouble with your homeowners association or anything like that. Just letting it go a little bit longer, maybe 2 weeks rather than every other week. You could really help those pollinators get through those tough times. And then finally, also related to your lawn, when you want pretty much anything to grow in a monoculture, so that idea of having grass only, it often, and I would say pretty much always, takes chemicals to maintain it. If you want a perfectly green single grass lawn, you really can only achieve that with chemicals. And so here's where I'm asking you to back off those chemicals a little bit. A big reason for that is that, particularly with pesticides, many times we're trying to get rid of something specific. Around here, it's mosquitoes, right? I don't like mosquitoes either. They drive me crazy. I get bit by them. I don't like them in my yard either. However, when we spray for mosquitoes, there are pretty much very few, if no pesticides that are very specific. So in other words, when we spray for mosquitoes, we're killing bugs. We're killing mosquitoes, yes, but what we're spraying doesn't only kill mosquitoes. We just have not come up with a pesticide that can only kill mosquitoes. And so as a result, you're taking a bunch of pollinators with them. You can kind of change when you spray. A lot of the companies that will spray for mosquitoes will tell you, oh, we spray only at a time to avoid pollinators. And yeah, that can help, but you're still really not avoiding killing other bugs in the process. So what I would suggest is kind of thinking about your chemicals in a really targeted manner. So I do use occasional pesticides. I do use occasional herbicides. I do use fertilizers here and there in my yard. But I really think about not spreading those things very broadly and thinking about how I want to target any one issue that I'm having. And also thinking about when is it better to target myself rather than my lawn. So when I think about those mosquitoes, I'm better off putting on some insect repellent, protecting just myself, because that's the only place I really care that the mosquitoes aren't, and then leaving my yard alone. So really kind of thinking about that in a just back off a little bit and help those pollinators out. And one particular pesticide that I would warn folks about, particularly as those who are, have bees, want to help honeybees, are these neonicotinoids that are being used more and more commonly on really just plants we put in our yard. So this is not a pesticide that is commonly used in crops. It is really used in the things that we're planting about this time of year. Lots of times right now, people are heading to Home Depot or Lowe's or places like that, getting their annuals so that they can have, those bright colors in their yard. And this keeps those looking perfect, not a single leaf bitten. But the problem is that we're finding more and more that these are really highly impactful to bees. They contain a chemical that is associated with tobacco, nicotine. That's the name that's in there. And that shouldn't be very surprising. The vast majority of chemicals that we use against insects are made by plants so that they're not eaten. And so the fact that this is going to be impactful is not surprising. But one of the issues is that even though we're really kind of treating the plant as a whole and the leaves, it ends up in the pollen. And if we have bees that are collecting that pollen, they're going to be exposed to this. And so if you're able to avoid plants that have been treated with these, and luckily they tend to be labeled well, that they are, avoiding these would be best. And I think there has been a good bit of pushback against places like Home Depot and Lowe's to use less of these. And so I'm hoping that this will be a problem less and less. But as soon as we get rid of one pesticide, we tend to develop another and then have to go through the whole process of figuring out who's getting harmed by this particular pesticide. So with that, I am going to pause and see if anyone has any questions for me. We kind of have a small enough group here that I don't feel like I need to have anything put in the chat. If you have a question, just speak up and I'll try to answer it for you.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Did you, Dr. Bowman-Cutway, did you know that bees are like the honeybees that we use in domesticated beekeeping industry, or most amateur farmers, are actually introduced to the United States? They weren't native to North America.
I do. So most of what we do, in fact, we have no native honeybees in North America. Anything that you're going to be using for honey is going to be Europe, Asian, or African. I do know that, and it's one of those things that I share with people, because people will be like, "Oh, we need to save the bees," and I realize how much they're concentrated on honeybees. I'm like, I'm not against honeybees, but I'm not as worried about saving them. I'm more worried about those 20,000 species of bees. But the good thing is that anything that we do good for the honeybees is generally good for the pollinators as a whole too. So yeah, that is a good thing to kind of keep in mind, that as we think about bees and pollinators as a whole that we realize that the honeybees don't actually belong here. They do good stuff here, but they don't actually belong.
On the Xerxes site, where is that list? I'm not sure why there's another.
Let me see how I found that. I think I went to, if you just Google Xerxes native plants, it will bring up pollinator friendly native plant lists. And from there, you're able to go to your actual, the southeastern region and get a good list.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I will add too that we pretty recently got a great new resource for native plants. In Warner Robins, Georgia Military College now has a native plant center that they sell native plants at. And they're very knowledgeable and I was just there I used my day off on Tuesday to go do some shopping. And they always have a really great selection, very reasonable. And when I kind of looked through this list, they have a lot of the plants that are on our southeastern list to purchase. So it makes it so much easier, because there was a time where when I would talk about this with people and they'd be like, great, I'm convinced. How do I get more native plants? I'm like, okay, here's the hard part. They're not, you can't just go anywhere and find them. Whereas now it's becoming more and more common to have more native nurseries that are really supporting these plants.
So I have one other question, because we have a field behind our house that actually the bees are next to. That is it's a buffer zone for Georgia power line.
Yep.
Goldenrod grows back there.
Great.
It not planted, it is just a field full of it.
Yep.
Is there a way to do a prairie kind of like, how do I put more things in that space? I mean, I don't mean by going and planting it, but like, is there a way to seed it or something else?
You could seed it. You would have kind of varied success there.
Okay.
Putting in some plants wouldn't hurt. So what you can do is you can kind of just use that area and dig up maybe like a 1 foot circle, just to kind of give a plant some room, put that plant in, and then let it do its thing. And then really the big thing, and what it sounds like you're already doing, is to mow on a kind of once a year, twice a year, even every other year, because that's what's really going to keep the prairie like, because with prairies, what you're basically saying is non-woody plants. Right. And if you let it go, you are going to get, gum, the sweet gum and pines, and you're going to get all these seedlings of trees coming in, and then you're not going to have a prairie anymore, and you're going to shade out a lot of those plants. So it sounds like you already kind of got that going. And it's just mostly of finding kind of a good mowing schedule to keep them there. And then just kind of slowly but surely just adding bits and pieces of additional natives in there who won't be hurt by your mowing, especially if you're kind of doing them once a year, really early spring when things are just kind of growing up. That will kind of knock everything back, and then everything will grow back real nice.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm seeing a couple things in the chat. Let me see. So I see, is there a garden layout that's best for native pollinators? What I would say is thinking about variety less than layout. With layout, you can think a little bit about height of plants. So a lot of times I kind of think about just starting with tall plants and working your way down, because then that means that they're just going to be that much more visible and accessible to pollinators. But that's where, a lot of times I'll have people ask me gardening questions, and I'll always have to be like, look, just so you know, I'm not a designer, right? So I can tell you about great plants that will do well, plants that are great for pollinators, but it's also, you want it to look good, right? So we're not necessarily trying to duplicate nature exactly in our yards, but instead in part of the design process, trying to think about what natives can we bring in that are going to work with our yard, but also work with the pollinators. So that's what I would say, is just kind of thinking about that year-round, a variety of all kinds of ways. When is flowering, its height, its color, all of those are going to be really helpful. And then from there, it's more about how you want it all to look. Let's see, are there certain types that are better for different pollinators? So plants can be specific to specific pollinators. So some things are really general. Anything that has a big open flower. So think about like a typical daisy flower. When they're big and open like that, they'll often attract all kinds of pollinators, because essentially what they have is a nice landing spot. So big things like a big bumblebee can go there, but also really light bees can go and kind of work their way around on a flower. But there are some flowers that are going to be really specific. Anything that is red and tubular tends to be specifically for hummingbirds. So hummingbirds are able to kind of get that beak and long tongue in there to get to the nectar. And very few other things can do that. And the red is very attractive. If you've ever seen a hummingbird feeder, you know that they tend to be red. You don't need to give them red sugar, just so you know, just plain sugar is fine. But the red color does attract them because they're looking for red flowers. That's what you're thinking of. And there's also a lot of things that are specific to butterflies. Again, they need a landing spot. So very few things can hover like hummingbirds. So anything, a lot of purple flowers that have, they're usually not open like this, but kind of open like they have a landing spot, will often have be pollinated by butterflies. And so that's again where those having a variety, rather than being like, oh, I want to do something good for pollinators. I hear this one plant's perfect for pollinators. Well, yeah, it's probably good for a lot of things, but it's not going to be good for everything. So the greater variety you have in your yard, the better it's going to be for many pollinators. Let's see, how much a space is kind of minimum? I don't think there's a minimum. One of the reasons I was kind of happy to give this talk even to college students who maybe aren't quite thinking about a yard yet, is you could have a few pollinators in a pot and you're still helping. That is, there's kind of no too little that you can do. And I think that's part of the message from Doug Ptolemy too, is I'm not asking you to rip up your yard and start over and plant everything native. In my own yard, I've got a couple camellias, I've got a couple azaleas that are Asian, I've got some English ivy that I'm still fighting and would rather not be in my yard. But even though I've been at this for 15 years, I don't have a purely native yard, and I probably never will, but any bit helps. So any kind of additional plant is going to be helpful. And then also thinking about how you're treating those plants. So, backing off the chemicals and really letting them grow are going to be good for pollinators. So start small and go from there. Any other questions that I can answer?
Well, other people are thinking of questions. I wanted to mention really quick that the Xerces Society, they have run a program that's called Bee Campus and Bee City USA. And so I've been looking at a lot of their resources as well. And maybe one day Mercer will be one of those bee-friendly campuses, but it might be a while.
Maybe, but it is a good goal to have. That's awesome. Well, it looks like there aren't any other questions, but I appreciate these were great questions, and I really appreciate y'all having me, and I'm very excited to see how this organization grows.
I have a quick one that's for you and about Mercer. Where is the pollinator garden that that is being planned? Where is it going to be located, and what are you trying to put in it?
Sure. So I have a greenhouse that is between the engineering building and the soccer field. Mm-hmm. And so that's where a lot of my research happens. I study a plant called fringed campion. And so we are growing it there. We have raised beds there. But in addition to that, I've been maybe not fully given permission, but I've been kind of carving out more and more space around the greenhouse and calling it mine by planting things. And so in front of the greenhouse is where we're going to have kind of our most official pollinator garden. And so I have bought some plants from the Warner Robins native plant a place there that I was talking about earlier. And we put in kind of a variety of plants. We put in some different types of sunflowers. We put in a couple different types of shrubs, a shrub called nine bark, some, I think, anise in there, Florida anise. So my hope is, one, to kind of have a variety to support pollinators, but also to be a place that if people want to see what a native pollinator garden looks like, that this could be a demonstration site. But then also to support that, I've been talking to the Hive Society about taking a little bit further, a little bit like how I was talking about your yard, of reducing mowing and encouraging more native plants to grow in the hill above the soccer field. So there is a hill there that is not particularly maintained, which is kind of one of the reasons why I think it is a good candidate that I don't think Mercer cares too much. Sometimes they're very picky about exactly how things look, but there they just simply mow every once in a while. And so my hope is to work with the landscaping folks to bring that down to mowing once a year, maybe even every other year, as we continue adding plants. And so that's going to be a much larger area that would support hopefully the hive that will be going on campus. And I learned something too. I was talking to Lisa and Forrest about the hive and how the pollen or the pollinator or the plants need to be a certain distance really from the hive for the bees to visit it. And I think this is going to be kind of the perfect distance and location. And it's also an area that we can kind of keep hopefully somewhat chemical free. Obviously, the soccer fields are going to continue to be treated because they definitely want that monoculture of grass there. But I think we can have a nice area that will be supportive, and it will also act as a way to show what is possible to help pollinators even in a highly landscaped location like Mercer's campus.
Real quick, because I didn't know about the hill part. Does the decision to put in the wrought iron fencing affect like that space? Do you know?
I don't know.
That's
Because
the chain link fence, right?
yeah, it's just chain fence now. And so far in other places, they have really highly landscaped anywhere where they put the fence. But because of that hill, my guess is they wouldn't highly landscape all of it, that I can imagine it being kind of right along that fence to keep it looking neat. But I'm still hoping that we're able to kind of carve out that space between
Okay.
And leave it fairly natural.
Nice, cool, thanks.
You're welcome.
I've actually kind of pulled up roughly where we were talking about putting the
I appreciate that. Thank you.
added some annotations to make it clearer.
Yes.
I tried to contact Physical Plant about that, and I'll be reaching out to them again soon through a different method to see if we can get any further on that. They are hard to get in contact with if you don't have.
I understand that. The good thing is, as we kind of talked about that, luckily Russell Volo is also a bee supporter and beekeeper, and he's been always pretty supportive of my wacky ideas that I bring him. And so I'm hoping that as long as we keep it neat enough, and granted we're putting some flowers in there, it's going to be pretty. I think we can make it happen.
Carrie would like you to answer Quinn's question in the chat.
What is it? Let's see.
What's your favorite native plant?
Favorite. Oh, so I was thinking about that today. I was like, I bet someone's going to ask me what my favorite plant is. It's impossible. I think it changes with each season and as I learn more plants. But I was thinking right now, early spring, there's so many great plants, and I'm thinking in my yard in particular, I have a beautiful kind of mound of spring beauty that right now is just, it's one of those things I planted probably 5 years ago, and it just gets prettier and prettier each year. And so that's my favorite right now, but ask me in a month and it'll probably change.
I have one really quick question. So kind of on the similar lines, but what would you say for a lot of beekeepers, it's kind of hard to find plants that are good for all seasons or for later in the season, especially like fall time. What would you say is a good plant that's native to Georgia that'd be good for maybe planting in the fall, so that way they have a food source later in this season?
To me, that big one is that solidago, that goldenrod, partly because it grows so well and becomes so numerous, that it is definitely what bees like. It is what they know is kind of out there. You don't have to kind of train them in on it or convince them or anything like that. And they last for at least a full month, probably much longer. And there's also that, I showed you one there, I would guess probably, I don't know, 30, 40 species at least of goldenrod just for Georgia. So it's one of those things where even within that group, you could have multiple species that then just kind of extend all through the fall. And I would say that's a good one. I'm going to go back to that list real quick and see if there's anything else. Oh, and any sort of sunflower. Our fall tends to be really dominated by yellow flowers. And so there's a lot of things that we generally call asters that are sunflowers, those kind of big wide flowers. And really, so the goldenrods are just like basically shrunk down sunflowers. All of those are going to be really good late season plants for those honeybees.
I know that witch hazel will bloom in fall, but I don't know if it's native or not.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually, witch hazel is pretty neat in that it sometimes, depending on the species, they'll flower almost in the winter. And so if you have anything that's kind of really out and about, either really late or really early, sometimes the witch hazels will help those too. Anything else?
That looks like that's about it.
All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. BC.
You're welcome. You guys had great questions. It was a nice time. I appreciate you spending your early evening with me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you everyone for showing up.